So welcome everybody. It's really a great to be with you, honestly. And then just to make things short, Yamis asked one question: What is migration? And in case you read the whole title of this amazingly good festival, and it gives the answer. Migration means social transformation. It is social change. But this has not been really seriously discussed. So what I'm going to do is I'm trying to give you some insights into this very complex problem uh, from a global point of view, but with a special focus of Eastern Europe. And I don't know whether how to switch. Why?
If you give me my phone.
Eye contact. Very. Thanks. That hurts, right? Okay. Uh, okay. So I've been working on international migration quite a bit in my life, and it has always been difficult what to do with this. And most of the people try to identify migration and migration studies as a specific field of social sciences, and the more I work on it, the less I believe in this. I think we should really get over this period when there are so many migration experts. Migration experts are for what? To explain that whether mass migration is coming, whether they are going to eat us or what's going to happen. So this is what migration experts are doing. I think you should go back to some of the classical questions of sociology and social change in order to understand what migration is. So I'm going to speak about how to understand mass migration. How can we understand this by social change as related to migration? What mechanisms are to be specified in order to establish concrete historical processes? So the key argument is going to be like this, that in order to understand mass migration, we need to do some very concrete historical sociological analysis. And I will explain what I mean by this. By social change and social transformation, I'm going to mean massive institutional change. So it's not just a single or limited one. In social and economic reproduction, it needs to be historically specific and dynamic. And very importantly, we have to talk about discursive and non-discursive elements at the same time. Then also, I think what Yanis was talking about is that previously migration was not understood as migration, but there were several terms for this. Actually, this is one of the biggest problems that we started lumping together everything, and then we are forgetting mass migration is always concretely and socially contextualized. And this contextualization, so one of the ways out of this migration debate, which is getting very polarized, which is getting very unfortunate, is to go back and then to name social groups within migration instead of just, and first of all, to forget these ideas of individually motivated actions. Okay, so the last point on this slide is something very important I would like to start with. So this whole problem of migration is very much due to an ideational change that due to the development of global markets, global labor markets, which of course want to measure everything in terms of abstract value, which wants to lump all these things together and then to give an answer whether it's positive or negative, whether it is bringing something into the economic growth or not. This has created the category of migration as a very abstract category, which means that they put together all kinds of legal forms, they put together all kinds of geographic, social mobility into this, and they would like to do this to evaluate the whole thing as such. This we can call, philosophically speaking, the reification. To use another word which I like in Hungarian, is a thingification of migration. Migration is becoming a thing to be evaluated, a thing to be measured, a thing to be valued, and then different answers can be given to that. Be aware of the saying that those people who are following anti-migrant ideas, they are the happiest with this because they can always just take out a part of this very complex phenomenon and then they can show it. You see how dangerous that is, and then they are rejecting everything else. And now comes the eye contact. Okay. Okay. Now, in case you look at uh, migration theories, I mean, we have once a student of mine calculated that I was presenting 26 theories of migration to them. So it's multiplied. So I see it on a daily basis, basically. But in case you look at some of the key theories of migration, then in case you look at them carefully, then behind the theories, what we can see is exactly social change and social transformation. Uh, so the first one, which is coming from geography, coming from the 70s, by a person called Zelinsky. Actually, a very important study. So a very important text. I think I would recommend you reading this, which is about migration transition, arguing that as soon as we are coming into this modern era, gradually, continuously, and in an unstoppable way, human societies are becoming much more mobile. Uh, and then this higher mobility, how this is achieved, of course, there are massive institutional changes behind that, most importantly, the marketization of societies. In case you look at also another theory, which we call macro level neoclassical theory, which comes from economics in some ways. It goes back to the 1920s. And then this is arguing that on a macro neoclassical level, there are two big regions in the world. One is capital intensive, the other one is labor intensive. The relative prices of these factors of productions are, of course, very different. Capital, the price of capital in capital intensive economies is relatively low, while in the other part is exactly the opposite. The labor has a relatively low value. And then what's going to happen, that was the theory, in case we have perfect market globally, then these prices are going to equalize. And during that process, migration is one of the mechanisms how it can actually get to equal, right? So the mass out migration from labor intensive parts of the world into capital intensive parts of the world. So that's going to be uh, one mechanism. So of course, the theory can be criticized. I don't know how many times and how many aspects. Most importantly, show me one moment of free market globally, and then I think mission is completed already because this not has never happened and it's not going to happen. And in case we see the political events nowadays, you see how it's not going to happen in the foreseeable future. This is one say back. I say what the theory, in case we look behind the theory, then it also means a dramatic social change, namely in order to equalize prices uh, in terms of labor. It's not only migration has to happen, but all peasant economies have to collapse, agrarian systems have to collapse in the labor-intensive areas. And what else can be bigger social change than this? Looking at this. So once again, you start looking at this is a migration theory, and what you get in the end, you get some ideas of social change. And the next one is, of course, we also like that migration. Experts love it. This is what we call cumulative causation, meaning that one migration is leading to further migration. And then this is very much related to the network idea with regard to migration, which means networks are distributing information. They are helping migrants a lot in terms of reducing risks and problems around migration. That's very importantly having some kind of an identity transformation in this respect. So establishing these diaspora identities and so on and so on. Uh, Now, what you can see that this building up of networks leading to more migration is also it's about social change in the sense that such processes would not happen without uprooting and without being able that these networks have to be able to mobilize. Now, Heinde Haas actually is one of the few scholars who is very close to this point. So he has been going on and saying to us, that's doing rightly and correctly, that the most important thing to study is social. He always talks about development. And I don't want to go into this, but it's about social change and the different trajectories of social change. And then he keeps on talking that mass migration is absolutely contextualized in this. He theories of capabilities and aspirations, which is gaining some momentum in the research, is actually what he argues is the linked to the individual or the micro level from macro level global social change. So in that sense, I think in case you would have invited him, he would be very happy also to participate in this festival. And just to quote some local colleagues as well, and Fassmann and his idea, which looks a very neoclassical idea of migration cycle. In case you look at that, how he identifies demographic change and how he identifies labor market changes as a key factor in migration, I think once again what comes out is social change in itself. And then also uh, a very famous text from Borges and Burrage from the 1990s, and then some kind of a historical structural school of migration, which is stressing colonial links, which of course is once again what else we can say. This is about historical structural development, and decolonization has been a key institutional framework of organizing migration instead of the neoclassical individual level neoclassical theories. Okay. But, and here comes a very important point. Of course, I'm very happy with all the theories in certain respects. And I think there's nobody who is going to ignore these theories because they have some relevance. The point, what I would like to make it clear, that nonetheless they are rather abstract level uh, theories of social change, but they lack ideas of concrete, longer term institutional change, and very importantly, concrete historical situations. So, without that, the claim that social change is to be analyzed when we are analyzing migration, I think cannot be really maintained. Thank you very much. Okay, and then I would like to just briefly, just for the sake of getting on ground, I would like to go back a little bit to history, the history of global capitalism, and then to name at least some of the key migratory processes and how they can be related to social change. First of all, the establishment of colonial capitalist economies during the 70s, 80s, and finally during the 19th century, which was accompanied by a mass migration from from the territories of the colonizers, uh, and then this has been a major process reconfiguring European states, reconfiguring very importantly. And let me stop here for a second. There's a phenomenal piece of Fernand Braudel from the 1970s when he's explaining what is the essence of this emergence of capitalism. And then he comes to a point and when he says that, look, these European small states were completely indebted. They borrowed a whole lot of money from merchants, of course, which they never wanted to pay back, right? I mean, show me a politician who would like to pay back anything in his life, right? And then, in order to please merchant capital, the small European states, which loved fighting each other, right, and spending money in a massive way, they basically started offering these colonial projects to these merchants. This led to the establishment of companies. This is actually the origins of shareholding companies in a lot of ways. Uh, and these were not just companies, but these were, I mean, the radical social transformers, right? So, in case you can imagine the British East India Company having 200,000 private soldiers at their end, they financed 200,000 soldiers, right, on a daily basis, right? And then how they change societies, then you can understand that this social transformation is a key aspect related to uh, migration. Of course, a lot of people talk about slavery, but slavery is also some kind of an institutional change, namely the establishment of global agrarian markets and plantation economies, right? And the plantation economies had a very difficult task because basically agrarian prices were not really going up or relatively slowly, which meant the profitability of these plantations were rather low, and they had basically two options. One, they invest a lot of capital into that to make it capital intensive, but then they have to borrow an enormous amount of money, or you get as cheap labor as possible. Of course, they chose the other one. I can tell you that East European landlords were doing exactly the same. So don't worry, that was also their option in a lot of ways. It shows how it is related to each other. And then, of course, one more thing which is very important, that this solution was very much related to racial hierarchy and, very importantly, violence. One thing which is very important in colonial capitalism is these rigid systems and violence continuously built into the political economy of these societies. And then it comes, of course, the biggest single mass migration, which we have experienced for the last two or almost 300 years already, namely the proletarianization of peasants and rural populations. That is to say, finishing a project of the world, which came into being most probably in the Neolithic era, in some form of a way. We are finishing peasant economies. We are making, we getting to this distance between laborers and their own assets in that sense. And then this is, of course, done in a massive unequal exchange project. And this has been going on. The last remaining peasantries at the moment in the world, I mean, even South Asia is getting beyond that. A little bit is left in Africa, but I can assure you uh, that's going to be the nightmare of all these right-wing populists. So Africa is going to change completely in a very short period of time, and that's going to happen. Of course, in case look at the history of migration, global wars, the reconfiguration of states, the construction of states and blocks of states. So states development as an institutional process, the establishment of nation states, the establishment of blocks of states have always been accompanied with a massive migration. And then the very last one is actually what we are seeing in some ways, the end of it, right? Which is a major and massive globalization cycle emerging from the 1980s, which is related to a new wave of marketization. Just to mention Michael Borovoy, who was killed a couple of months ago, uh, privatization, uh, reducing redistribution levels massively, globally and locally, and the establishment of global labor markets. Now, what do we study here? Do we study migrants? No, we study social transformation and social change. And then one aspect of that social change and social transformation is migration. So that can be some kind of a thesis which we can maintain. And I'm looking around. Thank you very much. Okay. Now, uh, I was born in Hungary, and what else can I do in my unfortunate country than start dealing with, very unpleasant topics, right? Like migration. Uh, and just, Hungarians are happy to use themselves to do kind of things. Uh, and then when I was thinking about this, then I was, so the last book about Dorothy Malinowski mentioned previously, and I was sitting down what to do with this, then I decided, okay, I need to write a book on social change. I don't need to write a book on migration. I need to write a kind of a social history, a structural social history, in order to understand what's going on. And then how do I understand this logic? And then I just show it to you. The first one is, so the argument is that opening up to globalization since the 80s is a key drive of that, and we can empirically prove that. Markets are being opened up, change in the society, and very importantly, these Polanyian terms are very important. This embeddedness, uprootedness, especially in a region which was having a so-called socialist economy, which I think is badly misunderstood up till now. But we can agree on one thing, that in terms of Polanyian terms, it was far more embedded. I mean, society's control over the economy was far bigger. But at the same time, and that's actually one of the things, most quote unquote migration scholars forget to link it or uh, to look at it from a discursive point of view. And that I think is super important. You will see some data, you will be surprised what you will get, but how this data actually supports some of the key intellectual or ideational histories of this region. One is what we can call ontological anxiety. We are talking about very small nations who are absolutely afraid of being evaporating or getting out into nowhere. Border changes, and then we will see how high out migration was that. And this reminds me of the famous Hungarian scholar István Bibó, the misery of East European states, small states, and their misery of nationalism. Now, migration turn uh, is something of a process which is going to increasing emigration rates, increasing immigration rates as well, specific demographic developments and patterns in Europe and regionally. Here, very importantly, Dorothy is sitting here and using this. So let's talk about varieties of capitalisms in the region, right? So they experience something similar but very differently in a lot of ways. So let's talk about varieties of migratory capitalisms as well. So let's include migration into that uh, into that function, and then how historical conjunctions and varieties of capitalisms come together. But at the same time, and that's very important, I would like to ask you to follow uh, the transformation of inherited discursive frames, right? And that's also very important because not we change not only materially, but we change on a ideological level. And at the end, what we come to the end is, of course, a beautiful rise of anti-migrant nationalism uh, in the discursive space. This is a something for strange neoliberal nationalism fighting European level migration management currents and a very important issue, polarization. And that's one of the reasons why they are sitting here at the moment. Okay, cool. Now here's something when I was doing my book, I literally fainted when I looked at this graph because that was everything which I did not expect, right? So the first thing is that unfortunately, in terms of public attitudes, it's very difficult to make global comparative analysis. There's one very good source we can use, a very good source. I mean, forget it when the deal with migration and migration attitudes. There's no very good source. There are just bad sources you put together. But the World Value Survey, the World Value Survey is the oldest one, which goes back to the 80s because migration was a non-issue in the 1980s to some extent. And then when they got interested, then they started making these attitude surveys, including the European Union. The European Union was not interested till the end of the 1980s in the whole story. And they got interested only from the 1990s. So the Lord Value Survey is something which goes back into that, but it's difficult to go even back into the 1980s. So I chose to make two periods and to put together public attitude surveys concerning 5 billion people. So in case you calculate how many people were asked, there 5 billion were asked, with one billion another. And then when I looked at it, that they had one common question, which they repeated. I mean, this is what I craze because all these attitude surveys, they change questions all the time, which means that we don't know what we are measuring and how we can compare it. And this was whether would you would like to have in your neighborhood a foreign worker or a migrant. And then here you can see the ones who are absolutely unhappy about that. And then in case you look at this regionally and globally, then something comes out of that. So actually, it has proven my point why I need to write a book on Eastern Europe. Uh, the first thing, I thought globally, due to this massive migration turn, these negative attitudes would go up. And they, up to 2019, they were not going up. Actually, it's rather stable. In case you look at the green line, it's stable. That's the global level. Then you look at some other things. There is a variation. The so-called West, which is of course a difficult thing to handle historically, but in case you're using, including Australia, then you can see that it is low level of negative attitudes and it's increasing a little bit, but not that dramatically. Of course, one is Latin America is in that sense the most relaxed part of the world for various reasons. I don't want to go into this. By Asia, is the extremely varied region, has always been, right? In case you look at Modi's India, Jackson, and so wherever you go, this is what you get, and this is not changing. Uh, and then there was only in Africa, very interestingly, which in the beginning, most surely because of the large scale wars at that time, it's very high and actually decreased. There was only one region which increased its negative attitude massively, which is that Eastern Europe. The color of orange is not accidental, right? Okay, just in bracket. Okay, so that's the army one explain. To explain that, I think once we need to explain this, why different regions are behaving differently. I haven't seen such studies yet. I have some ideas, but in order to keep going, I think let's try to get an eye contact to continue, right? Okay. Uh, Once again, sorry for my slides. I put too many things on it, but they have a it's very important for me. So when I've been dealing a lot with population discourses. Population discourses as kind of a biopolitically framed knowledge production, mainly by the elites, concerning the possibilities of the development of human population, and very importantly, of development populations under the control of certain states. Now, in case you look at that, then you can find all kinds of major discourses evolving by the 20th century. They started evolving from the 18th century. Capitalism is very much about the biopolitical management of human population. You have to be able, in a capitalist system, you have to be able to somehow discipline the population into this massive production process. And then, of course, a lot of scholars and elite people are trying to do this job and to figure out the mechanisms and the quote unquote laws how to do this, right? And then we have very different ones. We have, let's say, the Malthusian one is the most famous one. Everybody knows that. Then there is the so called demographic transition. It's a modernization theory of population change. Then you have the very conservative population discourses. I call it revitalization. Most people would say fascist. Um, First of all, I have problems with the term itself, but I think revitalization, which actually one of the key things, what for instance Griffin is also talking about when writing about these systems, I think is much better. Revitalization from a biological point of view, that I think is the essence, revitalization of these things. And then the various European ethnic, narodnik, or the socialist modernization version of them. Now, there's no need to remember any of these, right? The only thing I would like to say that from the 1980s, because they could not handle migration, all these population discourses could go negative and positive at the same time in this respect. Then migration became a major topic. What happened? It blew up these population discourses and it reconfigured them into these blocks. So actually, we can see a beautiful polarization. Migration is doing its business. It's polarizing all debates on population because of that. Allow me to get rid of it. Jack. Otherwise, I'm going to blow up. And that's not very right. Okay. So that I think is very important. And now we can see the emergence of 2+1, right? And it's not a commercial, so it's a 2+1 kind of a block. So one is pro-market, pro-migration. This is very much based on the Austrian School of Economics, or Mises, right? That how you can improve the productivity the most is basically you reallocate resources, including labor, in a way that it is increasing massively. Behind that, we see all kinds of international organizations as well who are promoting this, but also very importantly, that European Union as such as an idea is also very much related to these fundamentals, right? Then there is an emerging anti-migrant discursive bloc, which is of course highly selective, but very important. There's a misunderstanding, and if you look at my government, it's doing the same. It's very anti-migrant, but what does it want? It wants to use migrants in a very selective and a very repressive way. So they are taking a whole lot of black guest workers from Asia in order to put them into such brackets. So here, this let's call it conservative bloc. This conservative bloc is actually not doing anything about the market. It is actually satisfying the market, but it is maintaining a negative and selective discourse on migration. And then altogether, these are polarized. The so-called developmental discourses, which start with the critique of market, at the moment they are extremely marginalized, but we cannot forget that it might come later. Uh, how, Yanis, I hadn't checked my bot, unfortunately, so I'm lost. Hey, you're about what, 5 to 10 minutes. Yeah, okay. Okay, now let's make it quicker, right? Okay. So one more thing, and let me just stress a couple of points. So the East European region is, of course, coming from socialism. The socialist discursive heritage is very interesting and very important in the sense how they try to understand population development in their region. But one key aspect you need to remember that they were promoting, especially through the planning idea, demographic sovereignty. The state has a sovereignty in managing population as such. Plus, very importantly, with the sole exception of Yugoslavia, it was mentioned in the festivals program, all these countries basically ignored migration completely. So there was a region which had a belief in demographic sovereignty, right? I'm sure Mr. Orban is very happy when I'm saying this. Plus, very importantly, they were not talking about migration at all. It was taboo in a lot of ways. And then in these discussions, it did not come up. Okay, one more thing, which is a kind of a surprise that out of this demographic sovereignty idea and having no migration, for a while the elites, especially the experts in the region, were not against migrations. They were, I checked it in terms of population policy reports, they were promoting the idea that migration can happen from a demographic and an economic point of view. And then this elite is the one which is actually pushed aside by these new political leaders. So what I'm trying to say is that Eastern Europe, in that sense, is much more complex. And then let's move to the next slide. Okay. And here comes some kind of an essence for you. And then we go into these material parts for a while. And I would like to show you some of the results of a macro modeling. The macro modeling was carefully done in a historical manner. So I tried to figure out a macro modeling in which the multivariate analysis is not among different levels what we measure in the phenomenon, but actually what change leads to what change, right? That's the idea. Okay, because then I think it's much more sophisticated and historically correct. So I will show you the factors one by one. Then you can see that a change in one factor, what effect it has on the change in emigration in these countries, right? This is what I try to look at. And let's continue. And here comes something. Once again, I don't know why, but during research, I like fainting. When I looked at this, I checked it 4 times because there was something, I thought there was something wrong there. So, in case you look at country of birth data provided by the United Nations on the stock of immigrants, then you can see that Eastern Europe, and then look at globally, it was around 3% or 2 point whatever percent, and then it went up to 3 point whatever percent. Eastern Europe was, look at this, from 9 to 12%. In case you ask, which is the most open as related to immigration rate, the rate also, the number of immigrants as related to the sending population. And you can see which is the most open area of the world in terms of migration, even in 1990. That's Eastern Europe. Latin America, at that time, I don't want to go, it's moving between 5 to 7%. Why Eastern Europe is there? Why is then there ontological anxiety? You may ask the question because, I mean, globally speaking, they are experiencing this. Let's go to the next one. By the way, if you think, let's go back to the previous one for a second, right? This is also, the way of introducing cumulative causation, because what is important here that from a very high level we are going to increase this rate, right? Because of the network effect. So Eastern Europe was doomed to go like this. Okay, let's go to the next one. Now, income levels. That's very, very important in all kinds of migration analysis. And what is important here is actually two historical things coming together with regard to Eastern Europe. So, how the change in the relative GDP per capita, then how it was actually influencing this. So in the beginning, Eastern Europe had a massive decline in the 1990s, and then it started following global trends. What we are doing at the moment is we are following these global trends. And then you can see that was important for two reasons. One, in the beginning, this collapse was an important uprooting effect. Nonetheless, it was not producing much out migration in the beginning, but then later, this increase of income actually facilitated migration massively. Thank you very much. The next one, schooling. Uh, Very often it comes into any kind of a developmental analysis, and migration is schooling is very important for various reasons: language, skills, certain capabilities on behalf of migrants. So we assume that there is a strong link. In the multivariate analysis, at the end we could come to the conclusion that it looks very nice, but actually this factor is not really indicative of later emigration rate. And on the contrary, what we found was the following: that actually in the beginning, the opening up of the educational systems in this region actually reduced out migration, because for a while it was a buffer. So young people did not have to look for emigration. They started going into university for much longer period and much bigger numbers. In Eastern Europe, of course, in terms of education, is highly educated and it has been able to maintain its advantage. Let's go to the next one. Now, employment in agriculture, right? Many of the theories, including modernization theory, including world systems analysis, this is a very important factor. So, how we can analyze, this decline in the employment of agriculture, which, as I told you in the beginning, is some kind of a ruling capitalism, and also in the case of, in some ways, in socialism as well. How this decline is actually related to emigration. And then the first thing, which is very important, that in many countries of Eastern Europe, in the beginning, this decline did not happen, but actually it increased. So the crisis period of the early 1990s led to further employment in agriculture. And this further employment in agriculture was an alternative. So basically, in countries like Romania or Albania, one option for the population was going into agriculture, and one option was leaving the country. And they were doing this, and that was the sociological question in front of them. The point what I'm trying to make is that in case we look at this analysis, then we can see that this is an important factor, most importantly in the world systems analysis framework, and and it has proven important from the late 1990s. Thank you very much. Now, the next thing here, once again, which is very important, I'll just draw your attention to this graph here. It shows redistribution levels. Redistribution levels in a society are very important in terms of emigration. Agnes Harsh, a colleague of mine, has proven this very nicely, that in case you maintain a higher level of social redistribution, it means lower rates of emigration. And that's absolutely correct. Now, the thing about Eastern Europe is that globally we have enormous problems around redistribution levels. Even on an EU level, we had enormous problems around redistribution levels due to the neoliberal era. Eastern Europe is, of course, doing this. And in case you would like to name one country which is most radical in reducing redistribution level is my country, uh, which is always talking about social protection. At the same time, this is what's happening, which means that this shows again that this is an important factor in that. Plus, very importantly, this is related to the emergence of all kinds of social problems during this transformation. Uh, right. And then one of the things which for me was very important in this analysis, what is the role of, let's say, opening up the capital market in this region? That is to say, to check the original idea of Saskia Sussen, namely that there is a massive cross movement of capital and labor, meaning that the more capital comes in, the more people leave that country. It's a counterintuitive theory, but there are strong arguments how we can actually go through this. And then in this modeling, uh, actually, I try to use it in a way because actually this variable cannot, so it has to be a time lag. So it's with a time lag I checked, and immediately I will show you the results beyond cumulative causation. That is to say, what level of emigration we start from, together with the decline of agricultural employment. This is a key and systematic factor which explains in the 1990s, not in the 2000s and not in the 2010s. It explains why immigration went up in this region. And then statistically, we can actually very nicely prove this. Thank you, Elma. This is just to make you silent better. But these are the results, right? I just showing it to you that this is what I was talking about, right? Okay. Now let's continue to the next slide, right? Uh, and here comes some kind of a thing, kind of a one more warning. Okay, so we can say that globalization, when it starts with the massive opening up to foreign capital and the massive movement of capital globally, this leads to higher levels of emigration in most of the countries in the world, correct? Nonetheless, when this historical task is performed and even, let's say, deglobalization starts, right now we are in such a period from the 2010s after the crisis in 2008 and 2012. After that, it is stagnating and declining, which means deglobalization is going on. Nonetheless, emigration levels are still climbing up, which might be a very important insight in the thing why the debate is so fierce. Because some of the early period expectations that this development with foreign capital and migration is going to be okay. Now we can see that this is only happening, that migration is becoming intensive even without the contribution of capital to this, right? Okay. I think I've already explained this to all of you, so we can go to the next slide. Because, and once again, forget this, but I was very much interested in to figure out whether, in case we put into this macro modeling, which was global, we put the variable Eastern Europe into this scenario, what do we get? Do we have a distinct pattern in this respect? Does it have a special role in the whole story? And the answer is actually very interesting. Eastern Europe is special in its development, as I tried to show you, especially toward other semi-periphery and periphery countries and economies. But in a lot of ways, it is not distinct toward the West, right? So in case you look at this, because this is how you can do this modeling, uh, that not toward the West. And that actually shows again a classic problem that Eastern Europe is somewhat close related to Western development, uh, and this makes it distinct from other parts of the world. And let's continue, and soon we are finishing. So just to sum up, and I hope now the time is more or less okay, especially in this humid tent, right? So the first thing, the Eastern Europe, why Eastern Europe is important in this debate on migration and social transformation. One reason is that even before it entered into global capitalism again. It was already boiling, and there was some kind of a small state chaos which was going on already, and then this later just blew up, and it was very important. It is also important in the sense that it is maintaining, let's say, demographic nationalism, ethnicized discourses, and demographic sovereignty as an important discursive tenet. Uh, that's one of the things what a lot of states would not, a lot of elites would not follow. Uh, I haven't explained it to you in the graph, but I would like to remind you that it's not only out migration in which Eastern Europe is most open, it is also with regard to foreign capital. There's not a single other region which is producing such figures like Eastern Europe overall. Once again, here there are varieties of capitalisms, right? As I tried to say that. So Poland is different from Hungary, but overall, this region, especially in the 1990s and early 2000s, was the most open region in this respect. So there is some kind of a super dependency on foreign capital, together with the declining social redistribution levels, which leads to uprooting of the population. Uh, that's it. Schooling and all these things I've already explained. Uh, and then, of course, one very last point I would like to make is something of Polanyians. And do we see basically what Polanyi was predicting to us? So the social transformation of this movement into capitalism and participating in that system is actually leading to higher migration. It is actually contextualizing migration. It is actually doing its job instead of the migrants themselves in some ways. And this leads to some kind of a nationalism. This leads to some kind of a double movement. Partially, the thesis of Polanyi can be maintained, correct, but I say we should not take this, as many of our colleagues are trying to take this, that this is some kind of a double movement. That is to say, that Eastern Europe is actually learning from this experience. It is trying to maintain or to introduce certain institutional changes. No, it is maintaining the neoliberal system and nationalism at the same time. So this is a forced double movement. This is so basically what we can see in these societies. We have a propaganda of social protection, but basically nothing is done there, and this makes the situation a little bit worse than any other ways. And with this,